It was the summer of 2007 when Mark Reynolds, a devoted single father, decided to take his 12-year-old son Jacob on a hiking trip into the Sierra Nevada mountains. Mark had always loved the wilderness. He believed the mountains had a way of teaching discipline, patience, and courage. For Jacob, it was more than just an outdoor adventure. It was a chance to spend precious time with his father, away from the noise of the city and closer to the raw silence of nature. Friends recalled how excited Jacob was the night before, packing his backpack with snacks, a flashlight, and his favorite compass, a gift from his father. The Sierra Nevada, however, is no ordinary forest. Known for its breathtaking cliffs, towering pines, and hidden valleys, it is also notorious for its unpredictability. Sudden weather shifts, treacherous terrain, and vast, unmapped areas have made it both alluring and dangerous. Despite this, Mark was confident. He had years of hiking experience, and the trail he had chosen wasn't known to be especially dangerous. Early that Saturday morning, the two set out with wide smiles, promising Jacob's grandmother they'd be home by Sunday evening. That would be the last time anyone saw them alive. When the weekend passed without their return, the family grew uneasy. By Monday morning, Mark's car was still parked at the trailhead, untouched, with both their cell phones left inside the glove compartment. That discovery immediately alarmed authorities. Within hours, a search and rescue operation was underway. Helicopters combed the skies, volunteers scattered across marked trails, and rescue dogs traced every scent they could pick up. Yet, day after day, the forest yielded nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a single footprint, not even a trail of broken branches to suggest where they had gone. It was as if father and son had simply dissolved into thin air. What disturbed investigators most was the sheer lack of evidence. Normally, in missing hiker cases, some clue always surfaces: a misplaced backpack, a torn tent, or even signs of an animal encounter. But here, there was nothing. The campsite they were supposed to reach was completely empty, the paths undisturbed. Even the dogs, usually relentless in their pursuit, lost the scent just a mile into the woods. One search volunteer would later describe it as like following a ghost into the forest. There was a trail, and then suddenly, there wasn't. Days turned into weeks, and despite the relentless efforts of search crews, no answers came. The forest, quiet and indifferent, seemed to swallow every effort whole. With no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, and no natural explanation, the case grew colder with each passing day. By the end of the summer, the Reynolds disappearance had transformed from a local tragedy into one of the most baffling, unsolved mysteries in California's history, leaving behind nothing but questions that would remain unanswered for nearly 2 decades. In the weeks following the disappearance, the community around the Sierra Nevada was consumed by speculation. With no tangible evidence left behind, theories began to multiply like wildfire. Some insisted that the father and son had simply gotten lost, wandering off trail until exhaustion or starvation claimed them. Yet, seasoned hikers argued this explanation didn't make sense. Mark was too experienced to lose his way so easily, and the absence of any remains, after such an extensive search, was beyond baffling. Even the most remote areas usually yield some trace over time. But in this case, nothing emerged. As months turned into years, whispers of darker possibilities began to circulate. Some suggested foul play, pointing to the eerie fact that both cell phones had been left inside the car. Had someone lured them deeper into the wilderness? There were unconfirmed reports of strange individuals seen camping in the area around that same weekend. Men who didn't seem to belong to any known hiking groups. The possibility that Mark and Jacob had crossed paths with someone dangerous became a chilling theory that refused to die, despite the lack of concrete proof. Locals with longer memories recalled older, more sinister legends tied to the Sierra Nevada. Stories told of cult gatherings deep in the woods, rituals that dated back decades, even whispers of disappearances in the 1970s and 1980s that had never been fully explained. For some, the connection was impossible to ignore. Perhaps Mark and Jacob had stumbled upon something they were never meant to see. These ideas were dismissed by law enforcement as baseless rumors, but within the tight-knit mountain towns, they became fuel for fireside conversations late into the night. Adding to the unease, the Sierra Nevada was already home to countless myths and ghost stories. Hunters swore they'd heard voices calling in the middle of the night. Voices that didn't sound entirely human. Hikers reported being watched by unseen eyes, their camps invaded by strange symbols carved into nearby trees. One unsettling rumor claimed that certain valleys in the forest had never been mapped because compasses stopped working there. For those who believed in such things, the disappearance of Mark and Jacob wasn't just a tragedy. It was confirmation that the mountain was cursed. And then there were those who leaned toward the supernatural. A handful of witnesses came forward, claiming they had seen tall, shadowy figures moving silently through the trees around the time of the disappearance. These stories were often brushed off as hallucinations caused by fatigue or fear, but the details were eerily consistent. Descriptions of hollow eyes, elongated limbs, and an unnatural stillness painted a disturbing picture. Whether they were figments of imagination or not, these accounts added yet another chilling layer to the mystery, ensuring the disappearance of Mark and Jacob would never be seen as just another hiking accident. 18 years later, in the summer of 2025, the case had long gone cold. Most people assumed Mark and Jacob had perished in the wilderness, their bodies hidden somewhere in the unforgiving terrain. But the Sierra Nevada was vast, with sections so remote and treacherous that few ever dared to explore. That's when a group of adventure vloggers, equipped with the latest drone technology, decided to document the mountains from a perspective few had ever seen. Their goal was simple: to capture stunning aerial footage for their channel. What they ended up capturing would reignite a mystery thought buried by time. The drone soared high above jagged cliffs and deep valleys, its camera transmitting crisp, high-definition video. At first, everything was breathtaking. Sparkling rivers snaking through forests, waterfalls crashing into hidden pools, and ridges blanketed in fog. But as the drone moved deeper into areas nearly impossible to reach on foot, the scenery began to change. The forest canopy grew thicker, the terrain more wild and untouched. That's when the operator noticed something unusual on the monitor. A strange clearing that seemed too symmetrical, too unnatural, to be just another patch of open ground. Curious, the group guided the drone lower, letting its camera zoom into the clearing. What came into view startled them. Scattered beneath fallen branches and a layer of moss were objects that looked man-made. At first, it was difficult to make them out, shapes half buried in dirt, muted by nearly 2 decades of decay. But as the drone steadied, a clearer picture emerged, what appeared to be an old campsite, eerily preserved in the untouched wilderness. One of the vloggers, barely able to contain his shock, whispered into the recording, This looks abandoned, but not forgotten." The drone hovered closer, its camera focusing on what looked like remnants of equipment. A rusted lantern, tipped sideways, the skeletal frame of a tent, long since collapsed, and a torn piece of fabric that looked like it had once belonged to a backpack. These were not the kinds of things left behind by casual campers. They were the kinds of things associated with people who had simply never returned to collect them. The group exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they might have stumbled upon evidence tied to the Reynolds disappearance, a mystery older than some of them were. But it wasn't just the objects that unsettled them. The longer the drone hovered, the more the clearing seemed wrong. The shadows cast by the trees appeared to stretch unnaturally, almost as if the forest was trying to conceal what lay beneath. The silence in the footage was heavy, oppressive, making even the sound of the drone's buzzing seem intrusive. Though they didn't yet realize it, the vloggers had just uncovered the first real lead in nearly 2 decades. A forgotten camp that would soon reignite terrifying questions about what truly happened in those woods. When investigators finally hiked to the coordinates marked by the drone, it took them nearly an entire day to reach the clearing. The forest was dense, with uneven ground and tangled roots that seemed determined to keep outsiders away. By the time they arrived, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing. What they found was exactly as the drone had captured: a collapsed tent, corroded gear, and a silence that seemed unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The site looked abandoned for years, but strangely untouched. No scavengers, no signs of weather scattering the belongings. Everything lay precisely where it had fallen, frozen in time. The collapsed tent bore the marks of age, its fabric shredded and stiff from exposure. The investigators noted that the tent poles had bent inward, not outward, as though something had pressed down hard on it from above. Nearby, a lantern sat rusted, its glass cracked but still intact, half buried in dirt and leaves. A cooking pot, its metal blackened from use, lay beside what had once been a fire pit, now no more than a ring of stones covered in moss. The sight was haunting, not just because it confirmed human presence, but because it felt as though whoever had been there had left in the middle of something, never to return. Then came the boots. Partially hidden beneath the tent's collapsed fabric was a pair of hiking boots, upright and positioned neatly side by side. They didn't appear tossed or abandoned, but deliberately placed, as though someone had taken them off with the intention of putting them back on. Investigators found this detail deeply unsettling, as if the father or son had paused for a moment, unaware that it would be their final act, before disappearing into the woods. Stranger still, despite the years that had passed, the boots hadn't decayed the way one would expect. They were weathered, yes, but intact, almost preserved by the forest itself. Surrounding the camp, the trees seemed to loom closer, their branches forming a kind of barrier. Investigators noted how quiet it was. No bird calls, no rustling of animals. Nothing but the sound of the wind through the trees. Some of the team members later admitted that the place gave them an overwhelming sense of being watched. It was as if the clearing was not just a forgotten camp, but a stage where something unspeakable had once occurred, leaving behind an invisible residue of fear. Yet what struck the team most was not what they found, but what they didn't. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no remains. The camp was left in such a way that it seemed like Mark and Jacob had simply stepped out, expecting to return within minutes. But they never did. For investigators, this was both a breakthrough and a dead end. They had found the camp of the missing father and son. But the forest still guarded its darkest secret. What happened to them after they left it? Inside the overgrown camp, investigators began carefully cataloging every item they could find. Among the rusted lanterns and decayed fabric, one discovery immediately stood out: a small, weather-beaten backpack. When the zipper was tugged open, it revealed items that could only have belonged to a child. A broken flashlight, a water canteen half filled with murky liquid, and a notebook with pages stuck together from years of dampness. On the first legible page, scrawled in uneven handwriting, was the name, Jacob Reynolds. The discovery confirmed that this was indeed the campsite of the missing father and son, but the contents of that notebook raised far more terrifying questions. Flipping through the brittle pages, investigators expected to find ordinary drawings or notes. A child's sketches of trees, animals, or perhaps even maps of the trail. But what they uncovered was anything but ordinary. Page after page revealed dark, frantic sketches drawn in thick, uneven lines of charcoal. The drawings depicted tall, distorted figures standing among trees, their eyes hollow and their arms elongated. Some sketches showed these figures surrounding a small tent, others peering out from behind jagged branches. What unsettled investigators most was the sheer repetition. Over and over, the same figures appeared, as if Jacob had seen them not once, but constantly. The deeper they went into the notebook, the more disturbing the imagery became. One page showed what looked like a child and a man, presumably Jacob and his father, standing in the center of the drawing, with the shadowy figures closing in around them. Another page depicted a pair of hollow eyes, staring directly at the viewer, so crudely shaded that the paper had nearly torn through. On the final legible page, Jacob had scribbled words beneath one of the drawings. "They're watching. They don't want us to leave." The handwriting was shaky, rushed, and uneven, as though the boy had written it in fear. Meanwhile, scattered near the campfire, investigators found fragments of objects that didn't seem to belong. Pieces of wood carved with strange markings lay half buried in the dirt. The symbols were jagged, almost runic, and none of the investigators could immediately identify them. Some believed they were random etchings, perhaps the boy's attempt to replicate what he saw. Others wondered if they had been there long before Mark and Jacob ever arrived. The possibility that someone, or something, had marked the area with intent only deepened the dread surrounding the discovery. But the most unsettling detail came when the items were collected for examination. Forensic experts noted that despite nearly 2 decades of exposure, the drawings had not completely faded, and the backpack's fabric, though aged, had resisted total decay. It was as though the forest itself had preserved them, holding on to the evidence like a grim secret waiting to be revealed. To the team, it felt less like they had found forgotten belongings, and more like they had stumbled into a message deliberately left behind. A message that Jacob may have intended as both a warning and a cry for help. When the drone footage was reviewed again, investigators noticed something they hadn't caught. During the first inspection, just beyond the perimeter of the camp, hidden among the trees, there appeared to be a figure. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a shadow, a trick of the fading light filtering through the thick canopy. But as the drone shifted slightly, the outline grew clearer. Too straight, too upright to be a tree. The shape stood still, rigid, with a posture that was unmistakably human. Yet something about it was off. The footage was enhanced frame by frame, and the details became even more unsettling. The figure seemed unusually tall, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though observing the camp. Its body was obscured in part by branches, but the edges of its form were sharp enough to suggest deliberate stillness. Some investigators argued it could have been a lost hiker, or even a park ranger caught coincidentally on camera. But the timestamp told another story. The figure appeared for just seconds. And then, without any sign of movement, it was gone. What disturbed analysts most was the way the figure blended into its surroundings. Its outline seemed to ripple with the shadows of the forest, almost as though the trees themselves were concealing it. The longer investigators stared, the more unsettling it became. Like the figure wasn't entirely solid, something between a presence and a trick of perception. Those who studied the footage late at night reported feeling uneasy. Some even swore they felt as if they were being watched while examining the video. When ground teams searched the area near the tree line, where the figure had appeared, they found nothing. No footprints in the soil, no broken branches, no sign that anyone, or anything, had stood there. The earth was undisturbed, as though the clearing had been untouched for decades. Yet, multiple experts confirmed the same thing. There had been a figure. The camera didn't lie, but the forest gave nothing in return. As word of the discovery spread, locals began to draw connections between the figure in the footage and the drawings found in Jacob's notebook. The hollow eyes, the towering shape, the stillness. It all seemed too similar to be a coincidence. The thought was chilling. Had the boy captured the same thing in his sketches, nearly 2 decades earlier? And if so, what was it doing there now? Standing silently at the edge of the camp, waiting, watching. Despite renewed investigations, the forest refused to surrender its secrets. Forensic teams scoured the camp, drones mapped every inch of the valley, and experts analyzed the footage of the strange figure for weeks. Yet no bodies were ever recovered, no bones unearthed, no definitive answer uncovered. It was as if Mark and Jacob had simply stepped out of existence. For investigators, it was maddening. For the families of the missing, it was heartbreaking. And for the locals, it only confirmed what they had long believed: that the Sierra Nevada was a place where the rules of the natural world didn't always apply. Rumors began to swirl once more. Some claimed that Mark and Jacob were still out there, wandering the mountains, somehow caught between life and death. Others whispered about a presence in the woods, something that chose when to reveal itself and when to remain hidden. The boy's chilling words, scribbled into his notebook, "They don't want us to leave," echoed in the minds of those who read them. Who were they? And why had the forest preserved those drawings, almost as though it wanted them to be found? Over time, strange reports trickled in from hikers and campers in the same region. Some spoke of hearing faint voices, calling for help in the dead of night. Voices that seemed to belong to a man and a boy. Others described the sensation of being followed, though no one was ever seen. A few even swore they glimpsed 2 figures deep among the trees, one taller, one smaller, both walking silently before vanishing into the mist. These accounts were dismissed as superstition, but they spread quickly, fueling the legend of the Reynolds disappearance. The forest itself seemed complicit in the mystery. Compasses malfunctioned in the area, GPS trackers glitched, and even experienced hikers found themselves disoriented near the clearing. Search dogs refused to go near the site, growling and whining as though sensing something unseen. Investigators who returned often described the same unnerving feeling. Like the air grew heavier, like unseen eyes watched from between the trees. It was less like exploring a campsite and more like stepping into a place where something was waiting, something that didn't want intruders. And so, the story of Mark and Jacob Reynolds became more than just a cold case. It became a warning. A story passed from one hiker to another, a reminder that some parts of the Sierra Nevada are best left unexplored. The unanswered questions linger, gnawing at the edges of reason. What did the drone truly capture? Who, or what, stood at the edge of the camp? And why, after nearly 2 decades, does the forest still whisper their names when the night falls? Perhaps we'll never know what really happened to Mark and Jacob in the Sierra Nevada. Were they victims of a tragic accident? Or did they stumble into something far darker? Something that still lurks in those mountains today. The forest has given us fragments, eerie clues, and haunting glimpses, but never the full truth. And maybe that's the most terrifying part of all. Because when you step into the Sierra Nevada, you can't help but wonder if the wilderness could swallow them whole without a trace. What else could it be hiding just beyond the trees?
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.